Yeah, g'day YouTubers, Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to compare 043 gauge against 050 gauge in the same chainsaw. If you're running 043 gauge, it would mean that you've got a small chainsaw, either battery powered or petrol, and most likely it's going to be around the 30cc mark, 35 cc's. In which case, this is for my MS170 and 50 drive links. I have a battery powered chainsaw, but it came standard with a 14-inch bar with 050 gauge. And after using 043 gauge on the petrol chainsaw, I actually felt that the 050 gauge was a much better choice. And the difference was 043 gauge in the Stihl, the width of the semi-chisel chain is 3.2 millimeters wide and the length is 6.5 millimeters in length. Now, obviously through different manufacturers, those specifications might change 0.1 of a millimeter or something like that. It's not going to be much, but it's going to be that close. On the 050 gauge in the semi-chisel, I found out that it was 0.6 of a millimeter wider. So it was 3.8 millimeters wide, but significantly longer. It was 8.4 millimeters in length, and a standard 3/8 standard chain is about 10 millimeters in length. So it's not a bad length. So yeah, they're the same cost, approximately, give or take a little bit, but because they're longer, they'll last longer. So I've got no problems in using 050 gauge, and it's actually my preferred gauge in my MS170 and my MS180. I love that little tiny chainsaw. I use it everywhere where I'm cutting anything from about 1 inch, so little tiny side branches, up to about 6 inches. By the time I'm cutting stuff it's about 6 inches, I like to go up to I really should buy an MS261 or something like that there. MS380 is a little bit too big for cutting 6 inch. But certainly the MS170 and the MS180 can certainly handle 6 inch logs without a problem. So typically I use it for pruning and taking side branches off and chopping up small diameter type logs that are no bigger than 6 inches. Now, in wet timber, I certainly find out that chip clearance is not as good in 043 gauge. The chip clearance is certainly better in 050 gauge, especially in wet timber. In dry timber, I find the 043 gauge works fine, but it's that wet timber where I find chip clearance isn't good, and you can find out that the saw can bog down a bit. And you can even get jammed up. I've had that happen before. I've had it happen before on 050 gauge, but typically it happens more on 043. So what I'm saying now, that if you've got an MS170 or MS180 or any type of saw, could be any brand, it could be Husqvarna, it could be anything, and it runs 043 gauge, you may want to consider next time you buy a new bar and a new chain that in 3/8 low profile, go to 050 gauge. You'll find out that the tooth width is slightly wider and the tooth is longer, which means that the chain will last longer. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. And as I said, the bigger gauge, the 050 gauge, works better in wet timber as opposed to the 043 in wet timber. So what I'm going to show you next, and we'll just have a look at that, and it's the three different chains. I've got 043 gauge in semi-chisel, 050 gauge in semi-chisel, and 050 gauge in full chisel. And we'll have a look at that, and next time you're going to buy a new bar and chain for your small chainsaw, you may want to consider 050 gauge. Okay, so what I want to draw your attention to is the first chain that we see here is 043 gauge. It's a Stihl gauge, semi-chisel, and as you can see it's the smallest out of the three. The next chain beside it is 050 gauge. So you can definitely see that the tooth is bigger, and it's semi-chisel also. And the last chain that you can see is full chisel, and it's 050 gauge as well. I'll just try and get them dead level. And I measured them up just to see what the difference was. So the first one, the small one, the 043 gauge, is 3.2 millimeters wide and 6.5 millimeters long. So that's a semi-chisel. The second semi-chisel in the middle is 3.8 millimeters wide and 8.4 millimeters long. So it's much bigger. It's wider and longer. Better value for money. The full chisel is 4 millimeters wide and 8.4 millimeters long. So it's the same length, but just a fraction wider. Not much, but a fraction. Okay, so we've used these chains on the MS-170 and the MS-180. Now, I don't have a full chisel in 043 gauge, but I would imagine if I did, it would be roughly the same specifications as the 043 semi-chisel in length and width. There is a little bit of variation, like I've measured a few others from Ryobi, and I've got a few other chains from different manufacturers there, and they're all, look, give or take a little bit. 0.1 of a millimetre here, 0.1 of a millimetre there. But generally they're fairly close. Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. I'm just playing around with the 3/8 Pico low kickback chain, suits MS-170. 3/8 low profile, drive link is 1.1 millimetre, 043 gauge. And what I wanted to look at, and what I wanted to tell people out there, that you can go up on an MS-170 or a MS-180 to 050 gauge. There is some beneficial in doing that, and one of them is the cost. An 043 Stihl semi-chisel chain is only 3 millimeters wide and 6.5 millimeters in length. So there's not a lot of chain on there. There's not a lot. You wear it out fairly quickly. The alternative is to go up to 050 gauge. And what I found out, that it's 3.8 millimeters in width on average. I've tried a few different manufacturers, a few different chains, but significantly a lot longer, 8.4 millimeters on the semi-chisel and the full chisel, and even on the Ryobi chain I had on 050 gauge, it was 3.6 millimeters wide, but it was only 6.5 millimeters long. So that's just interesting. Being 3.6 millimeters wide, whereas the standard Stihl gauge is 3.2. So it's only a little bit wider. But certainly in other brands it can vary. And what I'll do is put them up against each other and do a close-up view so that you can look at it. Now, I've been using 050 gauge. I even brought a 100-metre roll of it, rather than use 043. Now, there's some battery chainsaws that are out there that run 050 gauge, and that's my Ryobi. They don't use 043 gauge. They use 050. And if I put my Hurricane 050 on there, they are significantly bigger in the full chisel and even the width. So how do they perform? Well, let's just say this. I don't use 043 gauge unless I've got extremely old timber, right? So what I mean by extremely old timber is that extremely old timber will put more of a strain on a saw, because especially with our eucalypt timber, when it dries out, the fibres may be short and entangled, but when the fibres are wet, they're more flexible. So as the timber dries out, those flexible fibres, when they were wet, are now hard and very difficult to pull apart. So when the chainsaw tooth hits them, they don't pull apart, and the chainsaw has to really do its work to cut through. So in that situation, if I feel that the 05 O gauge on the full chisel is bogging down a little bit, I'd swap back to the 043 gauge on the semi-chisel. That's only on very, very old timber that's laying out in the paddock. It's been there for years, which in most cases isn't the case. And usually if it's fairly old timber laying out in the paddock, it'll usually be bigger timber and I'll have a bigger saw anyway. But that's the only downside that I've ever come across. And the other downside is if you're cutting extremely wet timber, 043 gauge tends to bog down because the chip evacuation is a lot worse. I hope that information helps. So thanks for watching. Bye for now.